Hey everyone, I'm here with Mandy Smith. Mandy is the pastor at St. Lucia Uniting Church in Brisbane, Australia, and also the author of Confessions of an Amateur Saint, The Christian Leader's Journey from Self-Sufficiency to Reliance on God. Hi Mandy, how are you doing?
Hey, it's good to be with you today, Marcus.
Yeah, I'm so glad you're here. Mandy, tell us just briefly what you do.
Yeah, so like you said, I am the pastor here in St. Lucia, St. Lucia Uniting Church, and also do quite a bit of writing and speaking as well. And I'm working as one of the cohort leaders for the Eugene Peterson Center up in Western Seminary in Holland, Michigan, which is an
Hmm.
amazing place. If anybody's wanting to do an a DMin
Hmm.
in ministry or in writing, they have two different DMins that they've got going on there. So, yeah, those are some of the things. And I just got a new puppy. So, those are the things
Oh,
about me.
that's awesome. What's your puppy's name?
His name is Tobermory, which is one of our favorite places in Canada. So,
Oh,
but yeah,
Tobamori. That's
but
cool. And what kind of...
It's Tober for short. He's a Staffordshire Terrier, which I think in
Okay.
the US is often seen as a pit bull, but he's
Oh,
adorable.
okay, awesome. Well, that's super cool. Um, Good. So let me just mention before we get into the conversation about your book. You've been on the podcast twice before. This is your third time on. So let me just kind of point people to the other episodes that you've been on. First time you were on was over 5 years ago, episode 36, titled "The Vulnerable Pastor," because
Mm.
the book of title of your book that we talked about was "The Vulnerable Pastor." Second time you were on was episode 107, titled "Childlike Faith, Adult-like Leadership," and just go ahead on marcuswatson.com. You can find them there, or whatever podcast app you're listening on. This episode will be number 200 and something. I'm not sure yet, but somewhere in the mid
Wow.
220s. Yeah, or 240s, I think. So anyway, it's exciting to be able to do
Yeah,
this
that's
again.
amazing. Yeah, thanks for
Yeah.
having me on again.
Yeah. So good. So let me just kind of start with a big question, which kind of, as I was reading your book, I'm like, let's start with this. Why is it so hard to be a pastor?
Yeah, my goodness. I think the first line of The Vulnerable Pastor is something like ministry is impossible.
Mm.
And I think there's two levels on which I want to answer this question. One of them is just the practical level that, is obvious that there's just a lot of different kinds of work that you need to
Mm.
do to be a
Hmm.
pastor, that people see you preaching on a Sunday morning, but you're also casting vision and you're also dealing with difficult people and you're also leading meetings and, you're sweeping the front steps and
Mhm.
whatever,
Yeah.
dealing with the exterminators when there's an issue with whatever is living in the
Mhm.
walls and, not that I've personally had to deal with that or anything, but, we're not talking about that. So,
Uh,
so, like, that's just a hard job that takes organization skills and people skills and communication skills and visionary skills, and there's not many people who are good at all of those things, so you're often really
yeah.
uncomfortable in the places that you're not good at.
Yeah.
And then just on a spiritual level, we're pressing against the darkness. Like,
Mm.
people don't appreciate it until you ask them to share a testimony. They have to do a little 5-minute testimony, and suddenly they're like, "Oh my goodness, I couldn't sleep," and "Oh my goodness, like to tell the good news of God is making me feel really insecure, and I'm feeling all these accusations against me from the enemy." And I'm like, "Yeah, that's my every week I have to stand up
Yeah.
there and press against this darkness that wants us to be quiet
Yeah.
and wants to come against us and disrupt our
Yeah.
sleep and disrupt our sense of well-being and tell us that nothing we do makes any difference. And so,
Yeah.
spiritually, there's a good reason why it's hard to be a pastor, because not that we're the only ones who are
Yeah.
pushing against the darkness, but that is a big part of the work that we do. And of course, there's going to be pushback that wants
Yeah.
us to be quiet and wants us to be ashamed
Mm.
and wants us to be confused and
Yeah.
distracted. And so, yeah, kind of
Yeah.
two levels of it as far as I can tell.
Yeah,
And
for
that's not
sure.
even counting just the navigating. At this point in the church's history, there's this additional challenge
Mm.
because, there once was a time where being a pastor was probably one of the more stable jobs, because the
Right.
church never changes, the Bible never changes. But at this point in the church's life, especially in the Western world, there's just so much change constantly going on in the church and in the culture that you have to be an anthropologist, to be
Yeah.
constantly as discerning, like what does the
Right.
Bible mean for this moment, and what does the church do for this particular place, and
Yeah.
so you have to be a pioneer whether or not you are gifted in that.
Yeah. So
I'm
three
not really
things.
selling it to any
No,
potential new
I
pastors.
know, I know. Well, it's like, so my dad is retired, but he was a pastor, and
Mhm.
I never wanted to be a pastor, not because of him. I had other things that I wanted to do. And then one day I was like, maybe this is it. But my parents would always say, don't be a pastor. It's too hard. Don't be a pastor. It's too hard,
Yeah, yeah,
And I think it's fair to say that. And then when someone is called, okay, then you're called,
yeah, yeah. I
but
have heard somebody say, "Don't be a pastor unless you can't not do it."
yeah, yeah,
Like,
right.
don't do it for the
I think
money,
that's right.
don't do it
Yeah,
because it's just something nice to try, like, do
yeah,
it because it's the thing you have to do.
because you have to do it. Yeah. And that's probably in the midst of all the hard things that kind of keeps you going. At least one of the things that can help you keep
Mhm.
going. I appreciated the three things that you mentioned, in terms of what makes it hard to be a pastor. So there's the having to have all these different skills and having to deal with. I was kind of laughing internally as you were saying it because, yep, someone in one of the kitchen ladies on Sunday said, "Are these termites or ants?" And I'm like, "Oh my gosh, okay."
Oh, no.
It's stuff like that, right? I'm like, "Oh, I don't want to. Why do I have to do with that?"
Yeah, yeah.
But hopefully you have other people, right, who have some skills that you don't, right? That's part of leading a church is finding those people and helping them to use what God has given them, right? Um, and then the second thing you mentioned, of course, is just the spiritual challenge of it. But I also appreciated the third thing, and we'll talk about those second two. The third thing being just the way the world has changed, and that makes it
Mhm,
really hard. And we're not experts the way we. I should put that in quotes. Experts the way we once
mhm,
were about
mhm.
how to be pastors.
Yeah.
Um, Earlier this week or last week, someone had posted on Facebook that they were really appreciating your book, and I responded something like, "Yeah, I found myself nodding and sighing a lot as I was reading your book, just kind of like, oh, yeah, yeah, that
Mm,
kind of sighing, because I resonated with really all of it. And one of the things that came to mind is, so I was thinking a lot about just one of the really painful experiences in my own experience as a pastor, my own life as a pastor, um, some significant hurt, that happened
mm,
in one of the churches, and it took me a long time to kind of get back. I'd left pastoral ministry for a couple of years, worked for a nonprofit for a couple of years, and kind of tiptoed my way back in through some interim positions, and
mm.
now I'm still in an interim position, but open to, at this point, open to, okay, Lord, if maybe this is the right place, then I'm
Yeah.
open to that. But there's still this tension and this, or a fear almost, right? A
Mm,
reluctance, a resistance inside of me. I jotted down some of the things that I feel, right? So sometimes I don't want to give more of myself because it feels too risky. They don't deserve it. These are the thoughts that I have, right? It takes too
mhm,
much energy. It's too painful. I'm not getting paid enough, right, for this.
mm,
I
mhm.
wonder. I wonder if what I'm doing is even making a difference. And sometimes I wonder if this whole church thing even works, right?
Yeah, yeah,
And so I don't know. Is that
yeah.
bad? Is it
Yeah,
okay to feel
well,
that way?
I think all pastors feel those things at different times, and so I
Yeah.
don't think it's bad to feel that. I think it's good to be honest about those things that pass through our minds, and in some ways, the shame of thinking it's bad to think that actually pushes them down deeper and makes them take on roots in us. So
Mhm.
I want to say I don't think it's bad. What we choose to do about it is can be good or
Yeah.
bad.
Mm.
But I do want to say I'm just sorry that it's done so much harm to you, and um, I hope that it's freeing in some way to be able to
Mhm.
say that with others and to know like you're not alone. That
Yeah.
that this is just sadly it sometimes feels like it's killing us,
Yeah. Yeah.
And I've wrestled with this because I do believe that God brings our flourishing, and there are definitely ways in which, by saying yes to letting God use my gifts and step into ministry, I can see myself flourishing.
Yeah.
This is my true self in some ways, and in some
Mhm.
ways I can see ways that I have parts of me have died,
Yeah.
and I'm always torn because yes, I do believe that when we say yes to God, it brings our greatest freedom, and at the same time, um, the martyrs, when they said yes to God, went to their graves,
Mhm.
and so what does it mean if I think, yes, there is space in our tradition that sometimes this kills people? Sometimes it kills us very, very slowly.
Mhm.
you know, Martyrs
Mhm.
often have a sudden dramatic tragedy of death, but um, but sometimes the work of martyrdom is a pouring out, like Paul says, that it but I guess, like I have on the back of my bathroom door, you have died and your life is hidden with Christ in God.
Mhm.
And there was a time in my ministry when um, the "you have died" part was what I was focusing on, and in a way it was strangely kind of
Mm.
encouraging to be like, well, this is normal, you have died. If it feels like you've died or
Yeah.
you are dying,
Yeah.
that's like you're in good company.
Yeah.
But recently I've just been focusing on that, and your life is hidden with Christ in God.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
strangely, and this is what I hope some people get out of my work, my
Mhm.
recent book, strangely, the very pain of ministry has the potential to be the place where we just need the Lord. We've got nothing else.
Yeah.
We've
Yeah.
gone out
Yeah.
on a limb because of him, and now we really need to cry out to him. And so it's a beautiful, like, what was intended for evil, God will use for good moment, where God's like, even that I'm going to use to make you a better leader, to equip you so that you might not have the best strategies, but you're going to know how to teach people to need me and to rely
Yeah.
on me. So I don't know if that's what I think you just asked, is it bad? So I've kind of
Well,
gone on a tangent, but
yeah, but I
yeah,
was
I
hoping
think
you would
it's good.
expound, and that was
Yeah.
great. Yeah. Yeah. For sure. Well, yeah, I appreciate that. And I agree. It's not bad, right? But it is one of those. Well, there's some traditions in which one might say, "Oh, you should never feel that way," right? You
Mm,
shouldn't think those kinds of things. Uh,
yeah. I just don't have much time for that. And I think the
mm,
Psalms give us permission to just be really honest with the Lord, whatever it is that we're
mhm,
feeling, whether it's right or not. I don't think everything the psalmist says is correct, but it's
mhm,
true because it's true
mhm.
to what the psalmist is experiencing at that
Yeah.
time. And by bringing it to God, something is healed.
Mhm,
So
mhm.
if we're told, and this is one of the unhealthy things in the church, I think, is that we're told we should only think this or only feel that,
Right.
and we have to suppress all this stuff instead of releasing it to God.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the things I said in my email to you the other day, as kind of in preparation, was that it felt like the book is a little bit like a psalm of lament, right?
Yeah.
Where you're just saying, Lord, here's where I'm at, right? I'm confused, I'm exhausted, I'm frustrated, I'm scared. And then not every psalm of lament ends with a positive, but a lot of them do. And yet you are with me, right? And I
Yeah.
am with
Yeah.
you. Does that? Did you
Yeah,
think of it
there's
a little bit like that, or?
definitely. I realized at certain times that there was a lot in common, and I chose to
Mm-hmm.
use the language of confession instead of lament. I guess because
Mm-hmm.
I want to name our choices in the moment.
Yeah.
I think lament often remains um, about a posture of our spirit,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that's beautiful, and these confessions are partly about that. But I think what I really wanted to do with calling it confession was to pinpoint the moment when sin actually happens, which is not
Mm.
when the big drama explodes in the church and the church splits or the pastor gets fired or all the stuff that makes the headlines.
Yeah.
The real sin happens in these moments that just feel like we're just trying to survive, or we're just trying to feel good
Yeah.
about ourselves, which
Mm.
is a moment of turning from reliance on God to reliance on self. That
Mm-hmm.
happens on a Tuesday morning when you just, looking ahead to the day, and instead of praying, you jump on email. Just those
Yeah.
little, not that
Right.
writing emails in itself is a sin, but
Right.
if the posture is, I'm going to fix this thing, I'm going to control this thing, I'm going to understand this thing in my own strength, that independent spirit is actually when the sin begins, because we're like that branch that's being disconnected from the vine, and
Yeah.
we wither.
Yeah.
And so I think I've named for myself. I remember a moment when I was working on a sermon, and this moment of anxiety where I was just thinking,
Mm.
this is the week I'm not going to have anything to say, and this turning in myself that I felt of anxiety leading me towards, I got to read my books, I got to think more, I got to be impressive or whatever.
Yeah.
And I thought to myself, Lord, help me name that moment as
Mm-hmm.
a moment of turning,
Mm-hmm.
and that anxiety as the indication, I need to talk to God
Mm.
about this, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I guess that's the difference, that
Yeah.
the confession language is a naming of, like, I confess that this is what I want to do, that this is what I'm thinking, this
Yes.
is what I'm feeling. And the second the second meaning of confession of, I confess my faith once more. I choose, even though I don't feel it and I don't understand it, I choose God again. I choose to
Yeah.
believe that He's still powerful, that the scripture is still moving in
Yeah.
the world, that
Yeah.
the gospel is still good news, that
Yeah.
I still choose these things even though I'm
Yeah.
not actually seeing them or feeling them right now. So there's
Yeah.
definitely some overlap with lament, but I chose
Mm-hmm.
confession for that reason.
I love that. And I'm glad you clarified that. I am curious also about the rest of the titles. So, Confessions of an Amateur Saint. Where does that come from?
Yes, yeah. So one of the themes of the book is how we bring a secular kind of definition of professionalism into the church, because in the world, if there's no God, or if we're just trying to do our thing in the career world, then to be a professional is usually to be self-sufficient. Like, you are
Mm-hmm.
the kind of the thing that people are turning to be the problem solver.
Mm.
And it's your job to be the expert in something. And so
Yeah.
we bring that into the church, and forget that really uh, one of our professional skills is to be an expert in depending on something bigger than
Yeah.
ourselves. That's
Yeah.
actually a professional skill in Christian leadership. And so I kind of talk about how, before we were in ministry, when we were just amateurs
Mm-hmm.
at following God, we knew some things that are still professional skills, like
Yeah.
crying out to the Lord, loving the Lord, trusting the Lord, praying. Those are still professional skills
Yeah.
for Christian professionals. Maybe the best, like, maybe it's a professional skill in the middle of a meeting that has just hit the fan,
Mm-hmm.
not to look like the competent, capable one who can answer all the problems, but to say, this is the moment we pray, people. Let's take a breath. Like, that's a competency. That's a
Yeah.
professional skill.
Yeah.
So I'm playing around with the language of amateur and professional
Yeah.
there. Yeah.
I was wondering if maybe that's what, what you were doing.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think it's great. Yeah. I'm just reflecting on on my own wanting to be perceived as a professional, and at the same time gosh, and so this is kind of what you, I mean, in a way, the whole book, almost at times I feel, what's the right word? I feel like, come on, Marcus, right? Come on, this is not.
Mm,
And it takes a while to get there. I also think about myself as a young pastor, when I was like, oh, I'm just going to be the greatest, right?
yeah.
I've got all
Yeah.
the skills. I'm young, I'm hip, at least in some people's eyes,
Mm,
and then you get to a certain point where you're like, I actually do not have my act together the
mm,
way I thought I
mhm.
did, and that's
Right.
where then the reliance on God comes in. And
That's
you
a holy
realize
moment.
it is.
Yeah.
It's a holy moment. One of the things I thought about, I appreciated you also saying that, right, the sin happens way earlier than you think, or than what you might first point to, right?
Mm,
And I can't
mhm.
remember if you said it in the book, or if it's a thought that I had. So I'm not sure which of us should get credit, but
Well, the
but
book is just a part of a conversation that
I
we're
know,
having, so
yeah.
that's great.
But screw tape letters is kind of what I thought of at one point, where in order to keep the person far away from God, right? You want to start, essentially, you want to get them early in this little way that they won't
Yeah,
even notice,
yeah, yeah.
and and then the path that comes after that. It's
Right.
like just that you're on this path and the trajectories change slightly, but then you end up far from God. Yeah, yeah,
Exactly.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, when I was in youth group, I often felt a little bit outside of the church, even though I was very devoted for a young person, because it was all about like all these vices, all these juicy sins that you were doing,
Mm,
and so much of our kind of presentation of the gospel is about sin management, and
hmm
in these obvious, like you did this thing that we can measure, but Jesus talks about the heart, like if
mm,
you know if you commit adultery, yes, that's one thing, but what about if you lust? Like
yeah,
Jesus takes it back and brings
yeah,
it to this
yeah, yeah,
moment of choosing this versus that. And
yeah,
so I think it's really good for just us to just be self-aware of those daily kinds of sins. And
yeah,
um, I offer in the book I use this image from Jeremiah 17, which I think is so powerful, where it says, "Cursed is the one who's is relying on the strength of mere mortals. They're a like a shrub in the wilderness that is withered and dried up. And
yeah.
blessed is the one who relies on the Lord. They're like a tree whose roots go down into the
Mm,
stream." There's that image from Psalm 1 throughout all of Scripture, this
yeah,
tree whose roots are down in the stream, and it's never afraid in drought. And
yeah,
its leaves are always green, and it's always bearing fruit. We all want to be that kind of person, like just as
yeah,
a person, but also as a leader.
yeah,
And, we want our churches and the ministries we lead to look like that.
yeah,
And so we're like, okay, well, how can I work really hard to have leaves that are always green and to be always bearing fruit? And by working so hard to become that tree, we're becoming the other tree, because the point
hmm
is the tree is putting its roots out into something that's beyond itself
yeah,
and trusting that the stream is the source of its life. And so it's almost like a diagnostic, like where we are withered and drying up,
hmm
is that a sign? If we're depressed and anxious and whatever, there may be other things going on. Like, I don't want this to
hmm
be about judging ourselves or one
Sure.
another, but to just have a kind of a backwards diagnostic almost of like, if there is not life and flourishing coming from me and my ministry,
Mm,
is there a way that I've pulled in from the stream that
mm,
do I really believe God is the source of all energy and creativity and ideas in flourishing?
yeah, yeah.
And is there a way that if those things are not evident in me and in my ministry, that there's a way that I'm depending on myself and that I'm not stretching out
Mm,
beyond myself to God?
yeah, yeah,
Um, so I find that really helpful, that there's a moment where I'm
yeah,
like, oh, that's right. No wonder I'm withered today.
yeah, yeah,
I've
yeah.
got to talk to the Lord about that every
Right,
single day. Like
right.
our culture is strong and our education has been amazing. The media and social media and education, all that kind of stuff teaches us be competent, be self-sufficient, be
Right,
independent, and be
right.
impressive. And so it's no small thing to kind of go against that and say like, well, I have some agency and I have some gifts,
hmm
but even that comes from the Lord. We'd have none of
That's right.
that without him.
That's right. That's
Yeah.
right. Um, so I was thinking about capacity. How do we develop the capacity? And so I'm thinking about that in light of what you just said. Our capacity to do the work comes from the Lord, but so often we feel like we don't have the capacity.
Mm,
We talk a lot about, this podcast is with Church Leadership Institute, Todd Bolsinger, and we talk about adaptive capacity, but then there's also just the capacity to keep going. And so I don't know if you have any thoughts. And
yeah.
yeah, on developing capacity, or is that even the thing that we should be pursuing?
I think it's definitely a thing. I also think it's really good to give ourselves permission that sometimes if something doesn't seem to be working, it could be a sign that it's time to take a break or time to
Mm,
get out of this environment entirely.
yeah.
I think my problem is there is a way that when we trust God, we can say like, this is hard, but we've been told it's going to be hard. And it's just, I need to just trust that God will give me what I need to push through. And there have been times when God was like, no, I think, he's like,
Mm,
that's a sign you're supposed to take a break. I can march myself off a cliff almost sometimes, and
mm,
so it's really good to just name. It's not a faithless thing to sometimes say, no, this is a sign that either I need a temporary timeout or this is just not a good place for me to be.
yeah.
And that's
Yeah.
hard to come to that place.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
but having said that, sometimes it's just a time to just be like, well, I'll get a good night's sleep, but then in the morning I'm getting up and going to do it
Yeah.
again. And I should say, like, weaving in rest, like, I have to be so disciplined about rest that, like, I have a Monday and nothing touches my Monday.
Oh
That,
yeah,
like, I
that's
turn off
good.
my phone, and people know not to call me on that day. And if God's going to have to just carry the church on Mondays.
Yeah.
And so I think a part of that capacity is just being kind to ourselves and trusting that for us, and that rest is not only so that we can just be more productive, because in a way that's kind of a twisted version of resting for the sake of more productivity. It still keeps us in this I am just a mechanism mode. The rest is so that we can remember that there is a God who loves us, and we are not just here to fulfill a task.
Yeah.
I think that's a part of the capacity to continue in this is every Sabbath day I try to say to myself, I'm absolutely useless right now. I'm sitting in my pajamas. One day I was just sitting in my pajamas watching the sunbeams, and there's little dust motes floating around in the sunbeams. And I don't even know how long I was there for. I didn't know what time of day it was. And I just thought, I'm being absolutely no use to anybody right now, and God delights in me. Like, that's an important moment to try to come to.
Yeah.
And so I would say that one of the things that I think has helped me have capacity longer term is remembering, like, I am not here just to function and to get stuff done for God.
Yeah.
I am here to represent the God who also loves me, and to share that love with other people. And so we have to tap back into that. And but I do think also I can see in myself so many capacities that have grown from the challenges of ministry, that it has, obedience pushes us into places where we would say yes to things to the Lord that we would never, ever choose for ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so just discerning carefully, is this uncomfortable for a good reason that I'm supposed to say no to it, or is this uncomfortable because God's stretching me? I think it's important for us to discern which one of those it is.
Yeah.
And if it is that God is asking us to go there, to trust that He will, stretch us in our capacities. And I would say have a really good spiritual director along the way to help you discern all of that stuff and heal. I think that I'll say this and then I'll finish my answer to that question. But the true self, false self stuff, Merton talks about this, Raw talks about this, that the true self is the self that God knows. The false self is the person we try to be that God does not recognize,
Right.
And I think that so many of the uncomfortable moments in ministry are moments where your false self is kind of heightened. You're tempted to lead from that place. And so it's opportunities every time to go back to the Lord and say, who am I again? Who are you again? What are you asking me to do again? And it purifies something in us, even in the challenges, maybe especially in the challenges. So, like, as a people pleaser, I see a 9 on the Enneagram. Like, I have seen how having to choose between doing what I feel God calling me to do and making people happy is one of the most painful things that I've had to choose. And I see healing in me that I don't feel as motivated to just do whatever it takes to please people all the time, which is impossible, of course, So that's a long answer, but
Well, no, that's good. And like pleasing people, we could have a whole long conversation about all of that. I want to talk about one more thing, which is, and you touched on it at the beginning, just in a world in which everything is so different. There was a time, as you said earlier, right, when being a pastor, you kind of knew how to do it. There were certain ways of doing it that you learned in seminary or wherever, and it worked. You were taught these ways because they were effective, and that's not the case anymore. I remember early-ish in my ministry, I would sometimes think to myself, gosh, I just wish I could have been a pastor in the 60s, because that would have been so easy. At least as a white guy, it would have been easy. Right. And it's, we do things the right way. I mean, we preach, we do music, we do the youth and children's ministry, and all those things would have been a big growing church in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and those things don't cut it anymore. So with that in mind, like, how do we when we aren't experts anymore,
Mm,
right? How do we
mm.
lead when we just don't even know what to do sometimes?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it sounds really insignificant, but I've had to humble myself to daily ask the Lord, like, what are you calling me to today? And this has been a ministry of regeneration, so a church that was basically closed,
Mm,
wanting to have another try at it.
mm,
And so it was really kind of starting from a really unhealthy place. And
mm.
um, so maybe for a lot of people, there's much more of a maintenance mode,
Yeah,
um, but it just felt so overwhelming. How do you revive a church? How do you bring
yeah,
hope to
yeah,
people who are despairing? And yeah, it's too
yeah,
much. So
yeah.
just saying to the Lord every day, like, what am I attending to today? What am I
Mhm.
giving my yes to? And trusting that energy and ideas will come. And many of the big changes that have come here, like there is a miracle happening here.
Yeah.
I'm watching a church grow in numbers, but also
Mm,
the atmosphere has
yeah,
changed in the
yeah.
last, even in the last 6 months. We're seeing something that is
Mm,
miraculous happening here. And if you were to say, of course God is the one doing the work, but I had some part, I had to do something here. And I
mhm.
don't want to say so much that God was doing the work that I'm not an encouragement in any way to other people, because
Yeah,
I did do a lot of work.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
And any of the things that anybody could point to say, well, that maybe it's because Mandy did this or that, anything that feels like it was connected to some of the renewal,
yeah.
um, have just been moments that have come from prayer, which
Mm,
sounds kind of cliche, but if we truly believe that God is the one who holds this church, that he loves it more than we do, that he was here before us, that he'll be here
yeah,
after us,
yeah.
if we really believe what Jesus says, that he's the one building his church and the gates of Hades will not prevail against her,
Mhm.
then wouldn't we go back, like, wouldn't we talk to the source of the one who
Yeah,
sustains this beautiful bride and who loves her more than we do?
yeah.
And so maybe I'm just like really logical, that I'm like, well, I claim to say God is the one who's leading this church. I claim to
Mm,
say it's his spirit that motivates everything that we do. So shouldn't I be talking to him? you know.
yeah,
So I've had to pray more than I've ever prayed before, and
yeah.
lots of spiritual warfare too.
Mm,
Of just, I do think that we have a call as Christian leaders to be interceding on behalf of our people and our community,
mm.
to release them from strongholds.
Yeah, yeah,
And I think that's been a tricky turning, because a lot of the things that are really painful come from strongholds, and it's easy for me to just feel like a victim of those painful things, and to come to a place of standing in a place of interceding on behalf of my people and my congregation,
yeah.
and our mission, that even though I'm a victim in some way of some of the unhealth, that's not the worst thing. The worst thing is that we are missing our calling. So I need
Yeah,
to speak on behalf of that.
yeah. Oh, that's good. Um, yeah, when I was just thinking as you're sharing, a lot of times we talk about here are the kind of technical or uh, logical or whatever things to do when you don't know how to lead, and they're good. Here's you need to lead learning in your congregation. Here's how to help people learn new things. Here's how to you learn yourself. Here's how to navigate loss. Here's how to grow in resilience, and all these things. And these are all really good and important. But sort of at the heart of it all, if you're really going to lead well when you don't know how to lead, is you got to rely on God. I often think about actually something from, I think it was from your book, The Vulnerable Pastor, where you say that vulnerability in the sense of weakness, and is a ministry resource. All right. That's
Mm,
something that you said there. And
yeah.
when we can see our weakness in that sense, right?
Hmm.
Okay. And prayer, right? And going back to prayer, um I remember one of our elders once came to me, um and he was so stressed out about just the church. I was still kind of new there. So I've been at this church for 2.5 years now. And he's just like, I don't know how we're going to get through this. We're kind of just coming out of COVID, lost a lot of people,
Mm, mm,
15 people in church on Sundays, I don't know. And I was just like, hey, relax, just hold things lightly. I wouldn't have been able to say that had I not learned to do that through lots of
Yeah.
time with Jesus,
Yeah.
but in
Yeah.
that moment, and he was listening, and he was just like, ah, thank you.
Right.
Okay.
Wow. And that's a
No.
huge thing to not take on the anxiety of somebody else, but actually
Mm,
kind of let it die with you and
mm,
share something freeing with them.
mm, mhm,
That's especially those things usually happen in a moment where you're not
mhm.
prepared, and
Yeah.
someone wants to invite you into the anxiety, and to let it just not
Yeah.
go any further is a huge um, leadership gift.
Yeah.
But yeah, as you said, any of that only comes from prayer. And
Yeah.
actually, I will say that the desperate nature of this situation, like I think desperation is an untapped spiritual resource,
Mm,
and we
mm,
have a lot of desperation right now.
mm,
The person that you're describing in your congregation, we're feeling that in our own congregations. We're
mm.
feeling that in our denominations. Where as we look at the figures of churches closing, I'm in a denomination in Australia which is the third largest after Anglican and Catholic. It's the third largest denomination in Australia, and the statistics show that at this rate of loss, we've got 10 years left
Wow.
because of
Wow.
how old most of the folks skew
Yeah.
70s and 80s, and they're just not
Mm,
going to be around much longer.
yeah.
So, I mean, there is so much desperation that can fuel our
Hmm.
crying out to the Lord.
Yeah.
And so, probably one of the things that I would say that has brought something that feels life-giving in this context is
Hmm.
that I have felt so desperate for the Lord in this place, because
Hmm.
there has been very little sign of hope and life here in
Hmm.
the beginning,
Yeah.
that I've had to talk to the Lord with such fervor that something has healed in me, so that when I proclaim something, I'm not just reading a manuscript.
Hmm.
People are watching my face light up,
Mm,
maybe out of the desperation, but out
yeah.
of the choice to hope that God is still here, people. He has to
Yeah.
be here. We need him,
Yeah. Yeah.
myself included. Like,
Yeah.
we're out on a limb here, people. And if the Lord is not with us, then, we've got nothing. So,
Yeah.
so I
Yeah.
think that what people have probably seen in me, they didn't understand what was going on behind the scenes there, but my face lights up with it, partly because I
Mm,
just need him so much.
yeah.
And that probably, yeah, there's a lot of work going on behind the scenes for that to come out in a positive, hopeful way, and not in a
Yeah.
like desperate anxious way.
Yeah.
But yeah, what a beautiful thing if the desperation of our personal situation, our congregational situation, the
Hmm.
situation of the church around the world, what a beautiful thing if the desperation of it teaches us to rely on the Lord
Yeah.
with such a sense of our need that it actually
Yeah.
fuels us. This is something happens when you
Yeah.
cry out to the Lord. This is what the lament does. Those psalms of lament almost always turn to praise, because
Yeah.
there's a beautiful space. Because I'll say this and then I'll finish.
Mm-hmm.
What was I going to say? Oh,
Psalms of lament turn to praise. Yeah.
we are desperate because we think we need something, like
Mm,
more people to come to church, or more
yeah.
programs to put on, or some kind of political resolution, or whatever it is.
Right.
Like, we think like everything would be okay if we just had this thing. And so if we remember to turn to the Lord in that, we turn to the thing we actually need. And we might have to start talking about, oh, I want more people to come to my church, Lord. This is just what we need. If you just fix that thing, then
Yeah.
we'll be okay. And somehow, in the process of talking to him about the thing we think we need, we're like, oh, he's right here. We've got him all
Mhm.
along.
Yeah.
He's not
Yeah.
gone anywhere.
Yeah.
And the
Yeah.
desperation brought us to him, and then reminded us, God is here. We've got what we
Yeah.
need. This
Yeah.
this is who
Yeah.
we needed all along. So that brings life to lives and to communities, I think.
Yeah. That's beautiful. And true, right? Thank you, Mandy. This is so good. And I really love the book. And let me just say, I read it too fast because I was reading it in preparation for our conversation. But it's the kind of book, and I've said this to a couple other folks over the years. It's the kind of book that you want to read slowly, and it's like a devotional in a sense. If I could do it again, and maybe I will someday, just read one chapter or part a day and just sort of sit with it,
Yeah.
this space
Yeah.
to journal and
It
reflect.
can be read front to back, but also I made it so that the confessions could actually
Yeah.
be just read as a
Yeah.
standalone 1 or 2
Yeah.
pages. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So it's great. Mandy, if anyone wanted to find out more about you and the work that you're doing, is there anywhere they could go?
Yeah, I have a website called thewayistheway.org, and also you can find me on Facebook and Instagram at Mandy Smith Hopes.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, Mandy, thanks so much for being here. Thanks
So
for
good to
this.
be with you. Thanks,
Yeah.
Marcus.